7. And we're continuing our study in this chapter. The first several verses, verses 1 through 9, are focused on the things that Paul has done and the way he has helped them. He's asking them in verse 2 to make room in their hearts for him, and as they, of course, have done so for them. And what has happened is Paul started the Corinthian church, and Paul has been an influencer and a helper to them in a very big way all the way through. You know, like I say, he planted that congregation, and then he wrote to them the first letter that we have, 1 Corinthians. He helped them by having Titus be with them, and now Titus has come to Paul and relayed what had gone on in the aftermath of 1 Corinthians, and he's going to be sending Titus back to them, as we'll see a little later in next chapter. But Paul has done so much for them and helped them in so many ways. The problem is they've had some ingratitude, and there have been some that have said a lot of things about him. And as we come later on in this book, we're going to see in chapters 10 and 11 and 12 how Paul feels compelled to defend himself against the things that some are saying about him not being really an apostle, about things related to that. We noticed how this book began with Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus by the will of God, and why that was so important. And it's profoundly important then, and it's still profoundly important today. As we've noted several times throughout this study through this book, of all the things in the Bible that are attacked the most in the modern times, it's the letters of the Apostle Paul. And part of the reason is because of a lot of what we call doctrine in the New Testament, the things that tell us how we are to live and the way that the church is to be governed, and the way that we are to act morally and what is right and wrong, comes from those letters that Paul wrote to the specific congregations. And if those things are discounted, kicked to the side, all of a sudden a large portion of the New Testament, and therefore a lot of the commands, the laws that we have to follow in the New Testament, are kicked down the road. And in so doing, it completely undercuts the Christianity that the Apostle Paul and the other apostles were bringing on behalf of God to the people. Jesus in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John primarily was looking at the individual's life as a Christian. Jesus also, we talk about John the Baptist preparing the way for Christ. Jesus, by large measure, prepared the way for the church. See, because the church, the kingdom, had not been established just yet. Even though Jesus was giving us the new covenant, the new commands, it's still, the Christian age had not begun until after his death, burial, and resurrection, and then the apostles preaching on the day of Pentecost. You know, Jesus and what he taught, certainly for very good reason, belongs in the New Testament, and it's a part of our New Testament commands. But Jesus lived under the old law, and he died under the old law, and he resurrected under the old law. But yet, what resulted from what he did brought about the New Testament, brought about the New Covenant. So because of that, Jesus' focus was primarily in building up to the church. And he is giving credibility to the church by the miracles, by the things he taught, by the things that he did, in such a way that when he ascends back into heaven and the apostles come on the scene, they're able to point back to what Christ said and did to give the authority, to give the power, to give the notice that the world needed to be accepting of and to look at the church. And so Jesus' ministry is not about the nuts and bolts, if you will, the doctrine of the church. Those things came about as the church, after the church was established and as the church grew. Those things we see a lot more in the book of Acts and in the letters that Paul wrote. But if we kick those things to the side, then all of a sudden we don't have a whole lot that we are to go by and how we are to live, how we are to act as a church without that. And so if we start accepting, and a lot of the denominations have, if we start accepting the idea that large portions of the New Testament don't apply to us today, then all of a sudden really none of it applies. And you look at some of the denominations, and I'm certainly not going to name names on those, but you look sometimes and you hear about a denomination that has come up with something that they voted on, and you think, how in the world did they do that? And largely, the way they can justify that is they have kicked to the side things that the Apostle Paul and the other apostles wrote as merely being suggestions for specific churches in that day and time. And if we relegate a large portion of the New Testament that way, then it's a whole lot easier to believe a lot of things that just aren't so. And that's how a lot of the denominations do that, how a lot of times they're able to get so far off base, is because they have discounted and discredited large portions of the New Testament for that reason. And so it shows to me just how masterful the Bible really is. Because Paul could write about issues regarding his credibility in the first century, and now this is extremely important for a defense of the Apostle Paul and the other apostles' writings today. It is, to my estimation, the biggest problem facing, you might say, Christianity of today is the way that some want to pick and choose the Bible, much like a cafeteria. You go down to, I like cafeterias for eating at, or buffets, because I don't have to take it all. I can take a little of this, a little of that. I'm passing by this, and then get some of this. Why? Because I'm a picky eater. There's some things on that buffet I won't eat. And that works out great, because I can always find something I want. That may be great for a restaurant, but that's horrible, horrible theology. That's horrible Christianity. We don't get the opportunity to say, oh, I like this, but this not so much. It doesn't work that way. Okay. It is with that in mind that Paul brings this up. Paul deals with, as we go along, let's look at the latter part of this section. He's talking about the comfort that God provides in verses 5 and following. He's talking about how God comforts them. Why do they need to be comforted? Because they were troubled. And why were they troubled? Because of what Paul wrote to them in 1 Corinthians. Let's look in verse 7 and following. Talking about when Titus came back from them and was with them, And it says, and not only his coming, but also by the comfort with which he was comforted by you, as he told us about your longing, your mourning, your zeal for me, so that I rejoice still more. Now, what's going on there is, Paul sent 1 Corinthians to the Corinthians in Titus's hands. Titus took the book to them. And Titus was there when they read the book and stayed with them a few months and helped them work through questions that they might have had or work through issues of how to deal with that. And so Paul just didn't send that letter to them cold. Well, after Titus had been with them a little while, Titus then takes the information he's gained and he takes that to Paul. And he tells them, that's how Paul knows about what's gone on. And Titus tells them, you won't believe it. They've repented, they've changed, this is what they're doing, and they have some questions and issues and what have you. And so Paul was able to hear by way of Titus. And so Titus was that go-between. And so he's come and said this about them. Verse 8, for even if I made you grieve with my letter, I do not regret it. Though I did regret it, for I see that letter grieved you, though only for a while. As it is, I rejoice, not because you were grieved, but because you were grieved into repenting. For you felt a godly grief, so that you suffered no loss through us. And, we don't need to go back through 1 Corinthians, but if you remember, Paul was pretty hard on them in 1 Corinthians. They were divided. They had sin among them. They were filing lawsuits apparently against each other. And there was a lot of fighting going on. They were a church in absolute crisis. Many churches have split over far less than Corinth was going through. And so they had some extreme difficulty, and Paul had to settle all that straight. And such that he had to say a lot of harsh things, a lot of difficult things. And he recognized that they were grieved, and he heard it back from Titus that they were grieved. Hey, I can tell you, if we got a letter in the mail from an apostle, and obviously it ain't going to happen, but if we got a letter in the mail from an apostle, and it said what 1 Corinthians said to us, I'd be grieved too. To think that would be so harsh. And so, but the grief, Paul says, I'm not going to apologize for that. I'm not sorry for that. Why? Why was Paul not sorry for that? Well, they needed that. They needed that wake-up call. So what kind of grief? He mentions it there in verse 9. What's that? Right. They were grieved for a short while. It wasn't for a long time. It wasn't a permanent thing. We're the same way sometimes with our kids, aren't we? We know that there's a big difference between winning a battle versus winning a war. And sometimes our children will have a day in which they don't like us very well. And they may even say mean things back to us. But we recognize that someday they'll recognize the love behind what we've shown to them. The way that we didn't let them get their way all the time. Because we realize they're going to appreciate what it means to have some boundaries and to have some guidance, to sometimes be disciplined. Why? We grieve them for a short time, realizing they're going to be far happier in the long run because of what we're trying to teach them. And it's much like that with what Paul is trying to instill in them. Slapping somebody on the back and say it's going to be all right, you're just fine, is a lie if they need to be corrected. sometimes they need to change. There needs to be a difference made. And the Corinthians fit that situation. If everything in the Bible were warm and fuzzy, there would be no way to change us, to correct us, to make us better. You go to a doctor. You don't want them to tell you, you'll be fine, walk it off. Or smile more, unless that really is what's going to fix it. What do you want out of a doctor? The truth. You want the truth. You want the honest truth. Or you'd like them to have a little bedside manner. You'd like them to say it maybe in a kind way. But you don't want anything less than the truth. Because you want to know what you're facing. And you want to know the seriousness of the situation so that you can maybe meet it with the seriousness that is necessary. Well, it's the same way with your, where your soul is concerned. We need the truth, don't we? We need the truth, and we need it in such a way that we are able to understand the seriousness of it. And so Paul needed to grieve them because they were sorely off base. They were sorely mistaken, and they were sorely following the wrong path, and he had to shake them up. Mark?
While you're there, it's also important to recognize when you go back to 1 Corinthians, what he did and how he segued into that by praising them, by thanking them for the unity in faith prior to him attacking those who were divided among them.
Right.
So the presentation of that is hugely responsible for the outcome that he's getting here in this second letter. They made that change, but he uplifted them. If I had aught with you, I'm going to extol your virtues first, and I'm going to say, but, I've got this one thing that's been bothering me, and could we discuss it, or could we, and it's all in approach. It works here, it works in the business world. Paul is a great example of how to treat people.
Right.
It's not as much what's said, but how it's said.
Right. He called them brethren, and he called them the church of God in Corinth, and he complimented them, and then he tore into them. But also, you got to recognize, as even this chapter tells us, Paul had poured a lot into the Corinthian church. He established that congregation, and he noted that he went through a lot of persecution. He went through a lot of difficulty. He went through a lot of challenges so that they would be able to receive what they had. Paul had given them a lot, and Paul had a well-established relationship with them. So it wasn't simply Paul criticizing them, but Paul was very much a father figure to them. And so the correction that he gave them was out of love and out of a position of he knew them and understood their situation and was willing to help them and had sacrificed a lot for them in order to say what he said. Kevin?
Well, just like Mark said, I think it goes back to what kind of soil the Corinthians were. They evidently were good soil, but then he cultivated a little bit more at the beginning of that letter, and they responded properly. It's the same when we have trouble with a brother or sister. When we go to them, it's not for us. It's for their best interest. And a lot of times even if we go follow that, it's going to be all about us, and that's the wrong attitude to have.
Right. Yeah, that's very true. We struggle a lot of times in being like these Corinthians. And why I think these two books are so important, is because there's a whole lot of human nature in these books. Also, Corinth, I think we can identify a lot with as Americans. Many of the early churches that Paul dealt with were poor cities with a lot of poor members in the church. Now, by our standards, we don't really identify as rich, but compared to 95+% of the world, we're rather rich in our country. Corinth was a very wealthy city. Wealthy because it was a port city, one that had a lot of commerce in and out, and it was a place where fortunes were made in that day and time. Because of that, it was a very cosmopolitan city. It was a city that had a lot of corruption, had a lot of wickedness, and was known for that. It was known for its debauchery. It was known for its great wealth. And so those things kind of are a double-edged thing. Yeah, you could make a good living there, but yet there was a lot of things there with that could turn your head and take you away from what you ought to be. And so the Corinthians, as we're going to see later on in the next chapter, they are financially well off, and they can financially help other congregations in a way that very few of them could. But they struggled with a lot of the morality because of what their financial resources brought to them. It's the same way with our society. You know, a lot of the traps that Satan puts in our lives, those traps a lot of times can be kind of chalked up as what we would call first world problems. The issues that we might have that a lot of the world doesn't have and very few people in human history have. A lot of the things that would snare our minds and our hearts are those things that are our technology, our computers, our televisions, our radios, our whatever, that a lot of the world doesn't struggle with because they don't have them. And a lot of generations before us didn't have as well. And so we can recognize that we have temptation from that. Well, the Corinthians had the temptation of things and what to do with things like many others have.
Clint,
Yes?
I wonder how well Paul's criticism would have been received by the church today.
Well, I think it's a case-by-case basis in a lot of ways. I think part of why the Corinthians received it the way they did because of that personal relationship. But I think in a lot of ways, a lot of places would not accept it that way and not accept it on that measure, and largely for that reason. But there's really no way to know for sure. But I kind of think that maybe we wouldn't do as well as they did.
Paul may have had to come and show up like he promised.
Yeah, he might have showed up. He said, basically, don't make me come down there, is kind of what he said.
I think sometimes we have to get there. Like I mentioned before, this is written to the church.
Yes.
We're trying to clean up the church, not the world.
Yes, and that's exactly right. This is the church that's being talked to, and not the world.
Guidance and direction.
Yeah.
Clint, I think also so many times we forget Christianity flies in the face of everything the world stands for. When we become a Christian, that's when we need to lose the thought, what can the church do for me? It's what can I do for the church?
Yes.
That's what it's all about. And it takes a change of your mindset to do that.
Right. Paul told Timothy to preach in season and out of season. I would dare say that what we enjoyed in America of the last 150 or so years in America was probably about as in season as has ever been in human history. We're not so in season now as we were a few years ago. People may not agree with you, but very few people would take exception to you acknowledging God up until just recently.
Now we're ridiculed once again.
Now it's becoming closer. Yeah, we're becoming ridiculed more often, certainly more frequently, and we've got to recognize that it's important for us to know what we believe, why we believe it, and realize that there could well be persecution looming on the horizon. It's certainly happening around the globe. Not quite yet in America, like it has in the Middle East and some other places, but serious challenges are coming in our nation, and there's definitely some dark days on the horizon if the world stands. And it's happened in some big cities that some individuals have lost jobs because of their stand on particular things. I mean, there was I think it was the fire marshal or the fire chief in Atlanta that wrote a book and taught a Bible class for men, and he lost his job because he was trying to tell them to stay away from such things as pornography and homosexuality, and his stand on homosexuality, which comes straight from Scripture, caused him to lose his job. And he was a deacon in a particular denomination he was in, and took that stand and lost his position over that. We've kind of seen glimpses of that, and it may well come that because of that, you've either got to not hold a stand of the Bible, or there may be no Christians at all in government pretty quickly. And you might argue there aren't very many there now, but Dane?
If persecution becomes the greatest fear of the church today, we've missed the boat in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean,
persecution is not what we're told in the Bible to fear. It's a lack of faith for God. It's a lack of strength within. If we lose sight of that, then we're not going to do anything.
right, and fear of persecution cannot control us. We just got to recognize it's there. We've got to be much more afraid of what's behind us, as far as God. We've got to be much more fear and reverence or awe of God than we are of anything that the world can throw us. And that's really what the book of Revelation is about. If we put our faith and our trust in God, no matter how bad things fall apart, we're going to be a part of that promised kingdom that is present, that God's talking about. So, yeah, we should be aware of and concerned about, but Dane is exactly right. A fear of persecution cannot be anywhere near the top of our motivating factors. In fact, we need to stay true to the truth regardless of what kind of persecution arises. Kevin?
God told Joshua to be strong and courageous, and then a couple verses later it said to be strong and very courageous.
Right.
That should be a lesson to all of us.
Yeah.
It's going to take guts to see what Satan's going to be bringing to us in the next few years.
Yes, and you know what may develop? And what may develop is we have less lukewarm Christians. I'd say there's a lot of lukewarm Christians in the church, and if persecution really hits, it'll take away a lot of that lukewarmness. Whether they will just up and go away, or they'll recognize the seriousness and step it up. But it will take away a lot of lukewarmness.
That is an excellent point that Dane made about persecution. What's the whole purpose of persecution? Why does it exist? Why does it come upon the church? Why do we see now that it's like exploding upon the church or on our beliefs? Why is it happening? We have to ask ourselves that. Why is it happening? Why does persecution exist?
Opportunity.
It's opportunity and fear behind that persecution.
Oh, yeah.
For years, there's been fear of God and the faithful. Is that not right? Why?
Oh, yeah.
Why? We need to ask ourselves that.
Because
Why?
I don't understand any life.
Yeah.
No, I don't agree with that. certain things that's in us because we're humans that we know is wrong. But we as humans fight against that. And to an extent, persecution starts coming upon the faithful because of fear, of what they know a God-fearing culture can do.
Yeah. Satan is really adept at using different tools and different tactics. And, you know, let me kind of give you an example. I like to fish, and many of you do too. A lot of times the key to catching fish is being diversified. And what I mean by that is, sometimes they'll like a big old meaty lure. Other times they like a piece of bait that just sits there and you don't touch it, and they'll hit it an hour later. Sometimes they'll like something that is one particular color or another. Sometimes they like something that thrashes and splashes and whatever. And the thing is, you know, there's some days that they just hit so well, you could throw a rock out there attached to a hook and you catch something. There are other days you probably can't catch much of anything, but often, if you work at it, you'll find something that they'll take. Temptations are very much that way toward us. Sometimes we are caught temptation-wise because we give into persecution. Other times, it's because we get comfortable and happy and lazy. And some people will become lukewarm, much the way that we, in a lot of ways in our nation have, because of not having persecution. Because we have the First Amendment rights where we can have our free speech. And sometimes that works, and it's worked well, so that many churches don't stand for anything. They're just nice groups that come together and help each other feel good and motivate each other to smile more and feel better about themselves, but yet don't have enough truth, don't have enough doctrine to save them or anybody else. And so we get into that lull, that sleep, and we end up being lost because of that. But then there's other people that fall away due to persecution or whatever. And what it amounts to, and this is kind of where I'm trying to answer Mick's question, is many in the church and we as a nation have lost sight of what it means to fear and reverence and follow the Almighty God. And because we've done that, the world has lost respect for God. The world, a lot of times, we even doubt that there is a God. And part of it's because of the way Christians act. And we have not represented God the way that we should in a lot of ways.
Clint,
yes?
When was the last time we offended someone for taking a stand for God?
Well, that's the thing. We don't often offend anybody. And that's, that's part of the point.
Doing the right thing, the same.
Yeah, yeah.
Not trying to be offensive. That's easily done.
Yeah, you think Paul had, everybody in the church like him? You can't read, the rest of this book and think that everybody in Corinth liked Paul. He did not have 100% approval rating.
But they loved him.
Yeah, but they loved him. But, here's the thing is we have become so risk adverse. We've wanted to go along, get along. And because there are so many religious people in our nation, most of the time Christians don't stand out.
You're not doing something right if you're not being persecuted.
Well, that's exactly what it comes down to. And we in America have not been persecuted much. And so maybe, just maybe, that's the heart of the problem. Paul tells Timothy that Christians should expect persecution. It's a part of who we are. And, you know, we should do that. You know, Peter says that we should suffer for doing good. Well, I think that's kind of lulled us into being less than what we ought to be. Val Jean?
I just sit around and think now, just think of all the Christians who band together and start moving across the United States. We chase people away, I think.
Yeah.
We're really true Christians, you know.
Yeah, we need to certainly live it. We need to certainly live it. And, you know, we can hope that we would do that. He points out in verse 9 about godly grief. Now, we're tempted a lot of times to think that godly means godlike. But that's not what this is. God does not ever grieve for his sins. And so to say that it's godlike grief is not correct. But what it is, instead of being godlike, is you could say it is God-inspired. And the kind of grief that comes because we love and honor and respect God. Godly grief is grief that comes because of our connection with him. God does, in the Old Testament, says that he grieved, but it was not because of anything he'd done wrong, but because of what others had done wrong. And so godly grief is grief that we feel sorry for how it has harmed our relationship with God. Like when King David was confronted with his sin with Bathsheba and having killed Uriah, in Psalm 51 he writes the psalm and he says to God, against you and you only have I sinned. He took ownership of his sin and took, you know, recognizing what it had done between himself and God. I've sinned against you. Joseph, when he was tempted with Potiphar's wife, you remember what he said? He said, how can I do this and sin against God? And so his point was, he recognized that sin was an affront against God himself. And so he didn't say, how could I sin against my master, against you, against myself? But it was about sinning against God. And godly grief recognizes what our sin does or has done in relationship to God. And that's a lot different than feeling sorry because we got caught. And it is for that we're going to look next week at verses 10 through 16, and then maybe get over into chapter 8. There are outlines for chapter 8 on the podium in the back. Thank you.